Hello, and thank you for watching the Tennessee Breast and Cervical Screening Program 2021 Program Overview Refresher. My name is Elizabeth Berardi, and I am the Program Director/Nurse Consultant for the Tennessee Breast and Cervical Screening Program, otherwise known as TBCSP. Our objectives today include providing a brief overview of TBCSP, reviewing patient eligibility, transmittal sheets, and patient navigation, providing an overview of reimbursement, and highlighting procedures that need approval. You will see in the bottom right-hand corner a large black tab with a number on it. I've incorporated these into the slides as a reference to the page in the TBCS manual for which that correlates. I want to touch very briefly on the introduction, mission, and program goals of TBCSP. TBCSP is a CDC National Breast and Cervical Early Detection Program, or NBCC-EDP, grantee and has been since 1994. Our program, in a nutshell, provides screening, early detection, and diagnostics for breast and cervical cancers with priority given to disproportionately burdened populations. Our work today is focused very heavily in disparity identification and elimination. Our mission as part of NBCC-EDP is to decrease mortality and morbidity rates of breast and cervical cancer through increasing screening and early detection rates, as well as decreasing health disparities. We carry out our mission in conjunction with or through the help of our partners. Some of those include the Tennessee Cancer Coalition, otherwise known as TC2, the CDC and NBCC-EDP. We also work with the Immunize TN Coalition to help address HPV vaccination rates, and of course through our almost 400 screening and referral providers across the state. The services we provide and can reimburse for include wellness exams, screening procedures for breast and cervical, diagnostic services for both women and men, patient/client navigation, and community education and outreach. Screening providers, also known as enrollment sites or enrollment clinics, that are vendors or partners of TBCSP have several responsibilities. The major responsibility of screening providers is to identify and enroll eligible patients into the program. This can be done at a wellness exam or a problem visit if there is an issue. We require that a patient has a wellness exam, which must include a CVE and/or cervical cancer screening, meaning a PAP and/or HPV test, at some time during the 365 days that a patient is enrolled in the program. Obviously, if there is a breast or cervical issue that is identified, the provider should refer as indicated, and the clinic should follow up on this referral to gather the outcome. If breast or cervical cancer is identified and the patient is eligible for TennCare, then they should be referred to the local health department as soon as possible. Screening providers are also responsible for completing transmittal sheets, performing patient navigation as appropriate, and following reimbursement guidelines. Here you will see a snapshot of our fiscal year 2020 fact sheet. TBCSP served 11,680 unique patients, provided over 10,300 breast services, and over 4,300 cervical services. TBCSP screened more patients last year despite the pandemic than it has in over 10 years. We diagnosed 194 breast cancers and 234 cervical precancers and cancers. Here you can see that despite the COVID pandemic that began in early calendar year 2020, TBCSP, through our vendors, still served over 11,600 women in fiscal year 2020. General eligibility requirements for TBCSP includes being at or below 250% of the federal poverty level, being a Tennessee resident, but please note that citizenship does not matter, being uninsured or underinsured. Please note that being underinsured is having zero coverage for screening services if receiving screening, or zero diagnostic coverage if receiving diagnostics. High deductible or copays do not count, and those with only Medicare Part A and not Part B do qualify as underinsured. And finally, age/clinical eligibility. As a reminder, our program does accept self-attestation, but always follow your organization's policies and procedures for verifying information such as income. Clinical eligibility can be found on pages 30 through 35 in the manual. I want to issue a caveat before we get into these guidelines that these guidelines are what our program reimburses. If there are other clinical guidelines that are recommended from the provider based upon a patient's specific history and physical, we do our best to honor and reimburse those. We may ask for more clinical information to justify to the federal government why we pay for certain things. Breast cancer screening is for women aged 40 and older based upon USPSTF guidelines, which is every 2 years. However, for the remainder of calendar year 2021, we have expanded our screening reimbursement to cover annual mammograms regardless of risk. You will see in our manual that we have different screening recommendations upon average risk and high risk. So to reiterate, regardless of risk, we will reimburse annually. It is also worth mentioning that our program is heavily researching and reevaluating the guidelines we follow, and we recognize the potential issues with the ones we have adopted and plan to make recommended changes soon. Breast diagnostics are women and men aged 18 and older per NCCN guidelines. We have the ability to reimburse for breast diagnostic procedures for men through state and Komen funding. So any abnormal CBE findings, self-reported breast changes, including non-cyclic pain, all fall under the diagnostic criteria umbrella. Cervical screening is traditionally women 40 and older based upon the new ACS guidelines, which promote primary HPV screening. However, for the remainder of calendar year 2021, we have expanded our screening reimbursement to cover women aged 21 and older, still following ACS guidelines. Our program has formally adopted a hybrid model of guidelines. 21 to 24, cytology only every 3 years. 25 and older, primary HPV with reflex cytology every 5 years. However, we know some clinics do not have accessibility to a lab that can do this, so we will still reimburse for cytology and HPV co-testing every 5 years or cytology every 3. Finally, cervical diagnostics are women aged 21 and older following ASCCP guidelines. Our program also formally adopted the new risk-based management guidelines. Remember to obtain a TBCSP consent. This consent is good for 365 days from signature and should be reobtained annually. Make sure that your organization bills us for your work in enrolling patients into our program. This consent is available in English, Spanish, Arabic, and Vietnamese. If you recognize another language that is commonly needed in your clinic, please reach out to us and request that we provide translated material. Transmittal sheets are data sheets and completed to ensure payment. A fully completed transmittal is required to be submitted to us after a final diagnosis was made, whether that was cancer or not. We require it to be submitted within 30 days and technically 10 days if abnormal. This allows us to be able to quickly pay for those office visits and enrollment codes. And when you refer out, payments to our vendors also rely on your data. As part of your tracking and follow-up, you will need to complete this and again send it in with all completed information. Our goal is to have patients complete screening within 30 days and the time from screening to diagnosis or treatment within 60 days. We do know that due to COVID, lack of available providers, patient scheduling, etc., that this can be delayed, and that's okay. These transmittal sheets should be sent to the person you normally send information to, whether that is a coordinator or central office. With transmittals, a patient may have a breast and a cervical, or they may have both. There are a few items on here that are required. This includes the patient information, screening information including high risk for breast cancer, a clinical breast exam even if it wasn't done but they went for breast procedures, and a reason for mammogram even if one wasn't done due to patient being lost to follow-up or wasn't time for a mammogram. Mammogram date and result are also required if one was done. And please note that the referral date is only necessary if a patient was referred into your clinic from somewhere else. On the backside or second page of the breast transmittal, the screening MRI result is required even if one was not done and workup planned. If the patient needs any diagnostic procedures, such as an ultrasound, biopsy, etc., then the dates of those procedures go in their appropriate places and the workup plan will be yes. If any diagnostic procedures are performed, then the diagnostic disposition date and final diagnosis need to be completed. Treatment information only needs to be completed if breast cancer was diagnosed and treatment is considered the first date of their specialist visit, such as oncology. The cervical transmittal also has required information such as patient information, screening information, previous PAP, and reason for PAP and HPV test, even if not performed. All of these are required. PAP test result is required only if it was completed. On the second page, the workup plan is required. Similarly to the breast transmittal, diagnostic procedure dates can go in their appropriate spots and workup plan will always be yes. If any procedure was performed, then diagnostic disposition, date, and final diagnosis are required. Treatment information is only required if cervical cancer was diagnosed. On pages 41 through 45 in the manual talk about TennCare. While the health department handles most of this, it is important for you to understand patient eligibility. We previously mentioned that if a patient is diagnosed with breast or cervical cancer and they are eligible for TennCare, then they should be referred to the local health department. TennCare has a special category of immediate coverage for individuals with breast or cervical cancer or certain precancerous conditions to assist in completing the full application process. In order for patients to be eligible for PE TennCare, they must meet our requirements of TBCSP of being uninsured and 250% at or below federal poverty level. But they must be enumerated or lawful U.S. citizens and have the appropriate clinical diagnosis. As I mentioned, breast or cervical cancer qualifies, but other precancerous conditions that qualify include a BI-RADS4 or BI-RADS5 on breast imaging, because we know that these are highly likely to be malignant, and SIN2 or SIN3 requiring LEAP for cervical. If you have a patient that meets TennCare PE requirements, then they should be sent to or referred to the local health department as soon as possible for coverage. As at this time, the only way for a patient to receive this coverage is through the health department. The patient will be denied if they try to apply for TennCare themselves online or over the phone. Patient navigation needs to include documented assessment of the patient's barriers to completing recommended breast or cervical procedures. We are working on a more robust process for this, but at a minimum, it must be documented in your patient's chart. Navigation includes education and support above the normal, resolution of barriers such as transportation or translation services, continued client tracking and follow-up. Navigation is typically a minimum of 2 contacts with the patient. We recommend priority be given to those who would not otherwise complete recommended procedures without it by identifying and resolving those barriers. TBCSP will reimburse for navigation in certain circumstances. We reimburse for above and beyond kind of navigation using translation services, repeated scheduling, etc. It is $20 reimbursed per code and is able to be charged per patient per day. So if you contact a patient 3 times in one day, then you can only charge it once that day. But if you talk to the patient 2 times in a week to resolve barriers or provide translation for follow-up, then each day can be coded. The most important thing to remember about reimbursement is that we reimburse for ruling out or ruling in breast or cervical cancer. It's important to highlight that there are a few labs that we will pay for, but as the endnotes indicate, they are not for routine screening and only accompany certain diagnostic procedures. If you ever come across something that you aren't sure about, please don't hesitate to ask. There are a few breast and cervical cancer diagnostic procedures that are not indicated on our fee schedule that we can reimburse for, but the situations are extremely rare. So again, if there's something you have a question about, please don't hesitate to ask. According to our fee schedule, we have certain procedures that need approval due to high cost, direct connection to ruling out or ruling in breast or cervical cancer, or previous history of misuse. These can be located under the section in red on page 8 of the fee schedule. The cervical diagnostic procedures that require approval include LEAP, LETS, CKC, and EMB. These must be requested and approved on the appropriate form before scheduling the patient. When sending, please make sure to include all supporting documentation to support the request. It can be sent via fax or secure email to the person you normally send this information to, whether it be a coordinator or central office. Please allow 3 to 5 business days for a response, and please follow up if you have not received a response in that time. For the most part, if a patient needs a LEAP, LETS, or CKC and are eligible for PE10 care, then they should be able to be put on 10 care for these procedures. But we can pay for those that are not eligible for 10 care, such as those who are non-citizens or those needing an EMB procedure. Here is the cervical procedure request form. If you have a form that does not look like this, please reach out to receive an updated form. Before we talk about breast procedures needing approval, I want to point out our policy regarding reimbursement for women at high risk of developing breast cancer. It is not uncommon that we have providers say a patient is considered high risk just because she has a first-degree relative with breast cancer. On page 30 of the manual, we outline how we identify high-risk women according to NCCN guidelines. There are specific clinical scenarios that qualify as high risk, and if those aren't met, then a risk assessment using a risk assessment model such as the Gale model or Tyrer-Cuzick can be used to see if a patient has a lifetime risk of 20% or greater. We do recommend using the Tyrer-Cuzick model as it takes more family history into consideration when calculating risk and typically results a little higher, but both links are included on this page for your reference. With all that being said about high-risk identification, if a woman is identified as high risk, TBCSP will reimburse for screening MRIs. These must be requested and approved on the appropriate form before scheduling the patient. When sending, please make sure to include all supporting documentation to support the request. It can be sent via fax or secure email to the person you normally send this information to, whether it be a coordinator or central office. Please allow 3 to 5 business days for a response, and please follow up if you have not received a response in that time. The breast diagnostic procedures that require approval, including MRIs and CTs, these must be requested and approved on the appropriate form before scheduling the patient. When sending, please make sure to include all supporting documentation to support the request. It can be sent via fax or secure email to the person you normally send it to. Please allow 3 to 5 business days for a response, and please follow up if you have not received a response in that time. If a patient needs any of these diagnostic procedures and are eligible for PE10 care, then they should be enrolled into 10 care for these procedures. But we can pay for those that are not eligible for 10 care, such as those who are non-citizens. If your breast procedure form does not look like this, please reach out to receive an updated copy. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email and office phone number are located on this slide. Please note that you'll typically get a quicker response with email. Thank you so much for your time and the dedication you have to serving Tennesseans.